Anyway, let's get on to this. Right, I want to talk about what Sir Jim Ratcliffe... Oh, I've done it again! I'm going home. Bloody hell. What an idiot. Why can't you get his name right? It's not even the same. Sir Jim Ratcliffe is not Dan Ashworth. Bloody hell. What's wrong with me tonight? This is rubbish. We're not the biggest United... we're not the biggest Man United fan channel for nothing. I've not had anything to drink, Ronaldo. That would make it even more excusable. I think I've just had a very busy day. Deep pressure. Calm down. Right. We're going to discuss Dan Ashworth's first 5 transfers if and when he's appointed as Manchester United's Director of Football. And I'm going to give you a name that many of you, and you've not got it yet. No one in the chat has got it yet. So, this player, in my opinion, will be a high priority target for Manchester United that they're going to have to steal from Newcastle that Dan Ashworth will have identified. And if you know, you know. And if anybody gets it in the chat in the next 5 seconds, I will give them a massive, massive shout out. The midfielder I'm talking about is Ederson at Atalanta. Now, Newcastle, in the January transfer window, tried a lot of different things to get that deal done, and Atalanta wouldn't allow it to happen. So, a very, very, very interesting player to keep an eye on, because Newcastle will go back for him in the summer, and Dan Ashworth was a massive part of them trying to get him and going for him in the summer. Now, it'd be interesting as part of the severance if that player actually comes to Manchester United, or whether as part of the severance he's not allowed to go after targets that Newcastle were looking at, because that has happened before. I can't remember what club it happened with, but it happened where a director of football moved from one club to another, and as part of the severance package, they weren't allowed to go for targets that they'd already identified as targets for the club he was at. So I would keep an eye on that. Now, also, Darren Marco has mentioned Conor Gallagher. So Conor Gallagher at Chelsea, Calvin Phillips, who's now at West Ham, and Ederson at Atalanta were all 3 players that Dan Ashworth was looking to take into Newcastle. So does that lean towards the fact that they would be players that Manchester United would look at under Dan Ashworth? Yes and no. I think that obviously they're players he likes, but the circumstances of Manchester United will be different to the circumstances at Newcastle. However, what I would say is Newcastle's midfield of Joel Linton, Bruno Guimaraes, and obviously there's a bit, Lewis Miley or Sean Longstaff. They've got good midfielders, and they're trying to be in the Champions League, and they're trying to be a team that fights for top 4 and potentially titles. So, why would Dan Ashworth change his mind about Ederson at Atalanta or Conor Gallagher at Chelsea? Why would he change his mind about those players when they were players he was looking to bring in at Newcastle? So I'd consider those sort of players as players that he might bring in. I also think Scott McTominay is a player that could be sat there tonight going, this could be really beneficial for me if we do get Dan Ashworth. Certainly, I wouldn't rule that one out as well. Also, I think that I don't think this is a player that I'm sure he was linked to Newcastle as well. Somebody can check this, but I'm sure Todibo has been linked to Newcastle, and obviously he's a player that plays for Nice that Sir Jim Ratcliffe owns and that Ten Hag likes. I think Chiesa was linked to Chelsea as well. Sorry, linked to Newcastle as well. And I believe he's only got about a year or 2 left on his contract, so I'd keep an eye on someone like that in relation to wingers. I certainly wouldn't be ruling out Elise or Neto. Neto has been linked to Chelsea. I don't think Elise... Sorry, why do I keep... I'm doing it again. Sir Jim Ratcliffe is not Dan Ashworth, and Chelsea ain't fucking Newcastle. Bloody hell, I definitely need to go to sleep. My mind's just gone tonight. It needs a bloody rewire. Neto has been linked to Newcastle. I don't know whether Elise's been linked to Newcastle, but I certainly think Neto would be a player that would be considered as well. So I'd keep an eye on that one. And I think the big one, I think he's even on the thumbnail, is Evan Ferguson. As the striker, I think there's 2 names I'd mention early doors in relation to Dan Ashworth. Evan Ferguson at Brighton, who I don't know whether Evan Ferguson would have been on the books of Brighton when Dan Ashworth was there, but let me just double check that. But obviously be very, very expensive to get out of Brighton. I think he's just signed a new contract, hasn't he? And he's only 19 years of age. But Evan Ferguson has been at Brighton since 2021. I don't know is the honest answer. I don't know. I think Dan Ashworth would have been there, yeah. I think he would have been there. Yeah. answers on the postcard to that one. Was Dan Ashworth part of the recruitment of Evan Ferguson? Whether he was or he wasn't, I think it would be an interesting player, and I certainly think it would be something he would be looking at. Of course, for Manchester United, it would be problematic because of the price, but I certainly think you've got to keep that in mind. And also a player that Newcastle were looking at, and a player that you've mentioned quite a lot, and maybe we'd go for this type of a striker. Jonathan David is a player that Newcastle were looking at as well. They were linked to Garassi. I don't think there was anything in that, but they were quite heavily linked to Jonathan David as well. So there's a few players there. Edison at Atalanta, Jonathan David, Evan Ferguson, Chiesa, Todibo, Conor Gallagher, Neto. I think these are all possible players that we've been linked to already in different levels of, certainty, but also are players that Dan Ashworth's been linked to in his time at Newcastle in the last few weeks. So I'd keep an eye on those types of players, yeah. It's very hard to predict what a director of football is going to do. I think there's some really interesting quotes that I want to bring out about him and what his sort of strategy is. But as I said this morning, I certainly don't think we should be thinking he's just going to buy Brexit. I think Braithwaite, 100%, is a player that would be Branthwaite, sorry, is as a player that we would be looking at as well. And I think he's a player that fits the sort of dynamic that that Dan Ashworth would be interested, and potentially an honour at that club as well. Cheers from Prague, says Philippe. My buddy George has his birthday today. He's from a little community called Sabanov and loves United Stand. Can you please shout out him? Thank you very much, Philippe. Sorry for rattling you. It's not a lonely night and I'm not in Glazers Inn. Just think Sir Jimmy's doing what needs to be done so far. Long may it continue, says Darren. Yeah, but I don't think he deserves a bloody apology, Darren. I mean, bottom line is it's still quite a sensitive topic. I was like probably 95% of this fan base was Glazers out and Full Sail only. So I'm not apologising to anybody for buying 25% of the club. I still think that it's sad that he's had to get in bed with the Glazers to do a deal. And hopefully it will lead to something really positive where he removes them from the club. But it's sad that the Glazers are still here. I'm not gonna say I'm over the moon and jumping for joy about that fact. I just hope that he can achieve something within the parameters of what he's done. Sounds like you're having a date with Gary Neville today, says Mario Franco. And I don't know which players we will sign, but positionally, 2 centre-backs, 2 midfielders, 2 wingers and 1 striker. But can we do 7 signings in one window? It's highly unlikely, says Mojo, the legend. I don't think we're going to do that much. I think we will be disappointed in the summer because we always want too much and we never get it. But I will say this. When you look at what we've done with the CEO and when you look at what we're doing with the director of football, there's no reason to think that we're not going to have an amazing summer. I really do. I tweeted it earlier. I think that you look at what we're doing, these are decisions that we've wanted as fans for a long time. And remember, Sir Jim Ratcliffe is a fan. He's a lifelong fan. So are you surprised he's getting a good CEO in and a good director of football in? It's what you've been talking about for bloody years. Now, what happens in the summer, hopefully, is what you've been talking about for years. Major removal of players and major recruitment. And I think that this summer transfer window should really be the most